Hello, and welcome back. I'm glad you're here. Tonight's story is one I've wanted to tell for a long time. The story of a ship called HMS Terror, and a mystery that took nearly 2 centuries to come apart. One quiet voice at a time. So if you're ready, let the lights go down low, if they aren't already down. Let your phone rest face down somewhere you won't reach for it without thinking. There is nowhere you need to be tonight except right here, in the dark, drifting a little more with every minute that passes. If you'd like, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I like knowing who's out there with me in the dark. No hurry, no need, just curious. Now settle in and let's go north. Somewhere beneath ice that never quite lets go of the light, even at the darkest part of the year, a ship waited for a very long time. She waited so long that the people who first went looking for her gave up the search, one expedition after another, folding their charts and turning their vessels home. And the whole time the story of where she rested had already been told, passed quietly from person to person in the very land where she lay, in voices the searchers never thought worth trusting. Her name was HMS Terror. Her captain, when she sailed from home for the last time, was a man named Sir John Franklin, already old for the work, already celebrated, already sure of himself in the particular way that a certain kind of Victorian gentleman tended to be sure of himself. But by the end, when things had gone as wrong as they were going to go, it was not Franklin who carried what was left of the crew across the ice. It was another man, quieter, less garlanded, an Irishman named Francis Crozier, who had spent more years in cold water than almost anyone else who ever wore that uniform. His name will come back again and again in this story, because in many ways it is his story more than Franklin's, even though it is Franklin's name that history put first. And there is a third thread running through all of this, one I want to plant now, gently, without unpacking it yet, because it is going to matter more than almost anything else you hear tonight. Long before satellites, long before sonar, long before a single modern search vessel ever cut its engines over the right patch of grey water, there were people who already knew in broad terms exactly where these ships had gone. Not through instruments, through memory, through stories told by grandparents to grandchildren, carried the way that kind of knowledge is carried in a place where the land itself keeps the record. You will hear those voices more than once tonight, and each time, I want you to notice how long it took anyone outside that world to actually listen. If your eyes are already closing, that's exactly where they should be. None of this needs to be held onto tightly. Let it drift over you the way the ice itself drifted, slow and patient, and in no hurry to arrive anywhere. Picture, for a moment, standing on a deck of dark oak, somewhere far enough north that the sun in summer barely bothers to set, and in winter barely bothers to rise. The air would have reached you first. Not cold exactly, not at first, but thin in a way that made you notice your own breathing. Underfoot, the timbers would have felt different from any merchant ship you might have known. Thicker, closer together, reinforced along the bow with iron plating bolted in overlapping strips, because this was not a ship built for trade routes or fine weather. HMS Terror had begun her working life as a bomb vessel, built to absorb the recoil of mortars fired from her own deck, and that same brute strength of construction was exactly why the Navy chose her, decades later, for a voyage into ice that would crush almost anything else afloat. She sailed in company with another ship, HMS Erebus, the two of them setting out together with 129 men between their crews, provisioned for years rather than months, carrying tinned food, a library, a hand organ that could play through more than a dozen tunes, and enough coal to keep steam engines running through the worst of the cold. If you had stood at the rail as the coastline of home slipped away behind them, you would have felt something of what those men must have felt, a mixture of pride and unease that neither word quite covers on its own, the particular weight of sailing toward a piece of the map that was still, quite literally, blank. They were searching for a way through, a sea route across the top of the world that had drawn ships north for generations, promising a shorter path to the trade of the Pacific, and the Navy wanted this particular gap in the map closed more than it wanted almost anything else at the time. Terror and Erebus went further into the ice than most ships before them had dared, threading between islands whose names existed only as blank spaces and dotted guesses on the charts folded out on the table in Franklin's cabin. And then, somewhere in that white maze, the ships stopped sending word home. At first, this troubled almost no one. Arctic expeditions were expected to vanish from contact for long stretches. That was simply the nature of the work, and provisions had been packed for exactly that eventuality. A year passed with no great alarm. Then a second year passed, and the silence stopped feeling ordinary and started feeling like something else entirely, though nobody in London yet had a name for what that something else might be. Search parties were finally organized, ships sent out to comb the coastlines and the strait mouths, search parties that would themselves keep returning empty-handed for years afterward, finding scraps, finding graves, finding almost nothing that could be called an answer. But if the ships themselves left behind no wreckage that any searcher could find, no message in a bottle, no marked grave with the right name carved into it, how then could anyone ever hope to learn where she actually lay out there under all that ice and all that grey water? The searchers who came looking all through the middle of that century and long after worked from the assumption that if an answer existed, it would have to come from another ship like their own, from British eyes, British instruments, a British flag planted at the right coordinates. And so, again and again, they sailed past the very people who could have told them, almost from the beginning, roughly where to look. Inuit hunters living along those coastlines had watched ships pass through their waters for years before Franklin's expedition ever arrived, and they kept watching after the ships stopped being seen at all. Some of them later spoke when explorers finally thought to ask of a wrecked vessel seen frozen into the ice, of men who had walked south from her, exhausted and starving, of belongings traded or found along a shoreline that the Navy's own charts barely acknowledged existed. These were not vague rumors passed along for effect. They were specific, geographically anchored accounts, the kind of testimony that, taken seriously, might have ended the search within a single season rather than dragging it out across a century and a half. It did not end the search. The men leading those Victorian expeditions, for reasons that were partly cultural prejudice and partly simple institutional arrogance, treated Inuit testimony as folklore to be politely noted and then set aside, rather than evidence to be followed. A story told by a hunter around a fire was not, in their minds, the same kind of fact as a bearing taken with a British sextant, even when the hunter's account turned out, decades later, to be far closer to the truth than anything the sextants ever produced. That gap between what was known and what was believed is going to run the whole length of this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further into it. Because the strange, quiet tragedy underneath all of this was never really that HMS Terror was lost. Ships are lost. The ice took plenty of them before and after. The tragedy was that she was not, in the fullest sense, ever truly unknown. Someone always knew, roughly, where she lay. It simply took the rest of the world an almost unforgivable length of time to start asking the right people the right question and to actually wait for the answer instead of talking over it. Before we can understand why that silence lasted so long, though, it helps to go back further than Franklin, further even than Terror's launching, back to the century that made a voyage like this one feel not just possible, but almost inevitable, a prize that empires had been chasing across the top of the world for longer than anyone cared to admit. That reach for the passage did not begin with Franklin, or even with the Navy that finally sent him. It began generations earlier in the minds of merchants and mapmakers who looked at the top of the world the way a locksmith looks at a stubborn door, certain that somewhere in all that ice there had to be a mechanism, a channel, a way through that would shorten the distance between London and the silk and spice of the Pacific by months. You can almost feel the pull of it yourself, lying here in the dark, that old human itch to close the last blank space on a map. Kings had funded searches for it. Sailors had died for it, quietly, in ones and twos, long before anyone had heard the names Terror or Erebus at all. And every failure, instead of ending the dream, only seemed to sharpen it. until an empire at the height of its confidence decided the door could, at last, be forced open. By the 1840s, the search for a Northwest Passage had stopped being merely a sailor's dream and become something closer to a national itch, the kind of thing a whole country scratches without quite admitting why it needs to. Picture yourself standing in the map room at the Admiralty on some grey London afternoon, the kind with fog pressed up against the windows, and you would find the northern coastline of Canada trailing off into dotted, hopeful lines where no ship had actually sailed, only guessed. Somewhere in that white space, the men who drew those maps were certain lay open water connecting one ocean to the other, and whoever found it first would not simply save merchants a season or two at sea. They would prove something about themselves as a people, hardy and clever and destined in the way that empires like to believe about themselves right up until the moment they are proven wrong. The Royal Navy, in particular, had a use for a mission like this that had very little to do with spices or silk. Napoleon was beaten, the seas were largely at peace, and a navy that size, with that many officers trained for war and no war left to give them, needed somewhere to point itself. The Arctic became that somewhere. It was dangerous without being political, difficult without costing the treasury a war's worth of money, and it produced, when it went well, exactly the kind of hero the newspapers loved. A weathered captain standing at the rail of a ship locked fast in ice, having gone farther north or farther west than any Englishman before him. If you had opened a paper in those years, you would have found these men's faces again and again, names you may half remember from some other winter's reading, men who came home to dinners and portraits and promotions, while the ones who had failed or simply vanished trying were remembered more quietly if they were remembered at all. There is something almost tender about it, if you sit with it long enough in the dark. An empire that had already mapped most of the world it wanted still wanted this one blank patch closed, not truly for the money in it anymore, but because an unsolved puzzle is a kind of insult to a certain sort of mind. The passage, if it existed, would have shaved weeks from the long haul around Cape Horn, and that argument was still made in Parliament whenever funds were needed. But underneath it, the real motive had become pride, dressed up as commerce. Every failed expedition only deepened a kind of debt of honor. Every officer who limped home having charted one more useless inlet added his log to a shelf that was slowly, stubbornly closing the gaps on the chart until it began to feel, to the men who mattered in London, as though the last stretch of unmapped water simply could not hold out much longer. You do not need to remember any of the names in that last paragraph, or the shape of a single one of those failed inlets. None of it is the point. What matters is only the mood in the room by the winter of 1844, the sense among the men who ran the Navy that the moment had finally come to send an expedition so well prepared, so heavily provisioned, so thoroughly modern, that it could not possibly fail the way the others had. So when the Admiralty finally sat down to choose who would lead it, the question in that room was not really who could do the job. It was who deserved it. And those turned out to be two very different questions indeed. Sir John Franklin was, by then, close to 60 years old, heavier than he had been as a young lieutenant, and a long way removed from his last serious stretch of Arctic service. And yet he was also, in the eyes of the public and much of the Navy, exactly the kind of man the moment called for. Decades earlier, he had survived an overland expedition through the Canadian Barrens, so calamitous that his men had eaten the leather of their own boots to stay alive, and rather than ending his career, the disaster had made him famous. The papers had taken to calling him, not unkindly, the man who ate his boots, and there is something almost affectionate in that nickname. The sort of thing you say about someone you have already decided to admire, whatever the facts turn out to be. He had commanded ships since, governed a colony on the far side of the world, and come home only a few years earlier with his reputation a little bruised by colonial politics, but still, on the whole, intact. When his name was put forward for the Passage Command, there were officers in that room who thought him too old, too soft after years behind a governor's desk, but none of them said so loudly enough to matter. Franklin wanted the command badly, by every account that survives from those weeks, and the Admiralty, perhaps out of sentiment as much as sense, gave it to him. What the choice actually meant, in practical terms, was a matter of ships as much as men, and here the Admiralty had, for once, done something close to right. There were 2 vessels sitting in dock that winter that had already proven themselves against ice in ways almost no others had, and you would have known them by their names before you knew anything else about them, because names like that were chosen to be remembered. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, both bomb ships built originally to lob mortar shells at fortified coastlines. Their hulls reinforced far beyond the ordinary needs of a warship, so they could absorb the recoil of guns that would have shaken a lighter vessel apart. That same reinforcement, it turned out, made them exactly the kind of ship you wanted between yourself and a flow of moving ice, and both had already been south, not north, testing that theory against the pack ice of the Antarctic under a different captain a few years before, and had come home again to tell of it. You might picture Terror at anchor that winter, low and black-hulled among the ordinary rigging of the dockyard, nothing about her silhouette suggesting anything unusual to a person walking past on the quay. But step nearer, and you would notice the strangeness of her, the way her bow thickened toward the waterline into something more like a fist than a blade, sheathed in iron plate bolted over oak that was itself doubled and trebled beyond any normal shipwright's habit. Below the waterline, she had been given a false skin, an outer layer of planking meant to be ground away by ice, while the true hull beneath stayed whole, the way a man might wear a second coat he expects to be torn. None of this made her fast. She was, if anything, a lumbering thing under sail, built for punishment rather than grace, and that was precisely the point. What is easy to forget lying in the dark thinking about all this is how much of the 1840s still believed that steam and iron could simply overpower a problem that centuries of sail alone had failed to solve. So into both ships went a strange new addition, small steam engines pulled, of all places, from decommissioned railway locomotives, cut down and adapted to turn a propeller that could be lifted clear of the water when the ice closed in, so as not to have it crushed like an eggshell against the pack. It was not much power by any later standard, barely enough to nudge the ships along a few miles in open water when the wind failed them, but it represented something the earlier expeditions had not had, a sense that this attempt was different, more modern, armed with the century's newest thinking as well as its oldest ambitions. Below decks, steam pipes were run to radiate heat through the officers' quarters, an almost domestic comfort that earlier Arctic sailors, huddled under furs and burning whatever oil they had, would have found close to unbelievable. But a ship, however reinforced, is still only half the question, and the other half was what you did with the months you could not sail at all. Because everyone in that room at the Admiralty understood, in a way the newspapers rarely troubled to explain to their readers, that an expedition like this one would not simply sail to the passage and through it in a single bright summer. It would be caught, deliberately or otherwise, by autumn ice long before the work was done, and would have to sit there, frozen fast, through a winter darkness that could last very nearly as many months as it does hours in an ordinary night at that latitude, waiting for a thaw that might not come until the following summer, and might not come cleanly even then. So the question that mattered most, more than glory, more than the passage itself, was a quieter and more practical one. How do you keep 120-odd men alive, sane, and reasonably occupied through a darkness that swallows the sun for months at a stretch, aboard a ship locked motionless in ice that groans and shifts beneath you like something half alive? Earlier expeditions had answered this with discipline and prayer and whatever diversions an officer could improvise, theatricals staged on deck by lantern light, schoolrooms for the illiterate hands, strict rations of lime juice against the scurvy that had killed sailors on every ocean for 2 centuries before anyone quite understood why. Franklin's expedition would answer it with all of that again, and also with something new, a confidence, perhaps misplaced, that enough preparation could make the Arctic survivable in a way it had never quite been before. You do not need to hold on to the details of any of that yet. What matters, lying here in the dark with London's fog and the dockyard's noise already fading from your mind, is only the shape of the plan as it stood by the spring of 1845. 2 reinforced ships, a famous captain not quite so young as he once was, engines borrowed from railways, and a certainty shared by nearly everyone who mattered that this attempt could not fail the way the others had. What remained was the harder, slower work of actually provisioning a ship for a journey that no one could say, with any real confidence, how long it would take. And it was in that quiet, unglamorous labor of loading barrels and counting tins that the expedition's fate may have already begun to take its shape, long before either ship ever cleared the mouth of the Thames. But before there was anything to load, there was a ship to build, or rather, to remake. HMS Terror had not begun her life as a vessel meant for ice at all. She had begun as a bomb vessel, squat and broad-beamed, designed to carry mortars capable of hurling shells into fortified harbors from a safe distance offshore. If you had seen her in her first years, moored off some contested coastline, you would have found nothing polar about her at all, just a low, powerful hull built to absorb the recoil of her own guns without shaking herself apart. That was the whole point of a bomb vessel's construction, and it turns out to have mattered enormously later, though no one building her could have known it at the time. A ship meant to fire mortars needs a frame heavier and more rigid than an ordinary warship of her size, because the shock of each shot travels down through the deck and into the keel, and a lighter hull would simply come apart under the strain. Terror had been built thick through the ribs and solid through the bottom, over-engineered by the standards of most vessels her size, simply so she could shell a fortress without shelling herself to pieces in the process. She had done that work already, more than once, by the time anyone thought to send her toward the Arctic. You might imagine a ship's working life ending quietly, tucked away somewhere once her fighting days are done. But Terror's did not go that way. She had crossed the Atlantic under fire, taken part in a bombardment that, by most accounts, helped inspire the rocket imagery in what would become another country's national anthem, and returned from all of it more or less intact. It was that same heavy-ribbed, thick-bottomed hull, built for one kind of violence, that someone in the Admiralty eventually looked at and thought, here is a ship that might survive a different one. Because ice, it turns out, asks almost the same question of a hull that a broadside does. Can this structure absorb an enormous, sudden force without breaking, and a vessel already built to survive her own gunfire had a head start that no ordinary merchant ship or naval frigate could match. So when the Admiralty went looking for ships to send toward the passage, they did not commission something new from a blank drawing. They took ships that already existed, already proven, already sitting in ordinary or under repair, and set about deciding how much of each one could be changed. For Terror, the changing was considerable. Picture her, if you can, hauled up out of the water at Chatham, resting in dry dock with her whole underside exposed to the weather and to anyone willing to walk beneath her. That is where the real work began, not on the upper deck where a visitor might have looked for it, but low down, along the bow and the waterline, exactly where the ice would eventually meet her. Shipwrights fitted iron plating across her stem, layer over layer, until the front of the hull that would meet the pack was no longer simply oak, but oak wrapped in metal, built to take the grinding pressure of ice closing against her ribs without splitting them apart. The iron did not simply sit atop the timber like a shield, it was bolted through in overlapping sheets, so that if one plate buckled under pressure, the next was already gripping the wood beneath it. Stand close enough, and you could have run your hand along the seam where iron met oak and felt how deliberately uneven the surface was. Plate laid over plate like the scales of something built to be struck again and again without flinching. But a hull that could survive being struck was only half the problem, and it is worth pausing on the half that came next, because it is the part most people forget when they picture an Arctic ship. What good is a hull that can take the ice if the ship still cannot move through it? A sailing vessel depends on wind, and wind in the high Arctic channels is a fickle, unreliable thing, sometimes vanishing for days while pack ice drifts and closes around a becalmed ship at its leisure. The Admiralty understood this well enough to ask for something almost eccentric by the standards of the day: an engine. Not a purpose-built marine engine, There was no time, and frankly no need to spend that kind of money, but a second-hand locomotive engine, the sort that had until recently been hauling railway carriages on ordinary English track, pulled out of its regular service and lowered down into Terror's hold. You can imagine the strangeness of it if you try. A machine built to run on iron rails now sitting below the waterline of a ship meant to break through ice at the top of the world, its boiler reconfigured, its driving rod now turning a propeller shaft instead of a set of wheels. It was not elegant. It did not need to be. It needed to give the ship a few hours of forward motion under her own power when the wind failed and the ice began to close, and that, by most accounts, it managed to do. The propeller itself was built to lift clear of the water entirely, drawn up into a well cut through the stern when it was not in use, so that drifting ice could not catch the blades and tear them away before the ship ever reached open water. The rudder, too, could be raised on demand, unshipped and pulled up out of harm's way at the first sign of pressure. If you had watched the crew work the mechanism in dry dock, hauling on the chains that drew rudder and propeller up through their wells, you might have thought the whole ship had been designed less like a vessel and more like something meant to retreat into its own shell at the first sign of danger, which, in a sense, was exactly right. None of this addressed what might be the quieter, more persistent problem of an Arctic voyage, the one that had nothing to do with ice crushing a hull and everything to do with simply staying alive inside one for months at a stretch. A ship can survive the pack and still lose her crew to cold, and so the refit at Chatham reached well past the waterline and up into the living spaces where men would eat, sleep, and wait out the long dark. Warmth, in a climate like that, was not a comfort. It was closer to a piece of equipment, as essential to the voyage as the iron on the bow. The solution the dockyard settled on ran hot water pipes through much of the lower deck, fed by the same engine that drove the propeller, so that even with the boiler barely turning over, waste heat from the machinery could be routed through the spaces where the crew lived and worked. You would have felt it as a kind of low, steady warmth underfoot rather than anything dramatic, nothing like a roaring stove, more a persistent mechanical mildness pushed up through iron pipework laid beneath the deck boards. Alongside it sat the more old-fashioned answer, a large iron stove fitted for cooking and for heating in its own right, the kind of stove that would have been tended around the clock by whoever drew that duty, feeding coal into it hour after hour through a darkness that, this far north, could stretch on for months at a time. There was a shipwright at Chatham, one of many whose names the surviving dockyard records never troubled to preserve. A man like hundreds of others who spent that winter measuring iron against oak, marking where the next plate needed to sit, checking the fit of a propeller well against a rudder post that had never been designed to lift clear of the water, and it is worth pausing on him for a moment, not because we know anything specific about him, but because someone very much like him did this work, plank by plank, in weather cold enough to make the iron painful to touch with a bare hand. He would have known Terror's original bones intimately by then, would have run his hand over ribs originally shaped to survive her own mortar fire, and now being asked to survive something else entirely, and if he wondered whether ice truly compared to cannon fire, no record of that thought survives either way. What did survive in fragments are the accounts of just how much of the ship changed shape during that refit, section by section, until the vessel that eventually left England bore only a rough resemblance to the one that had shelled a fortress years before. Interior bulkheads were shifted to brace the hull from within, doubling the internal strength at points where the ice would press hardest. Extra beams were let into the frame below decks, turning what had been open cargo space into something closer to a reinforced cage, built specifically to keep the outer hull from flexing inward, even if the ice outside squeezed with everything it had. And there is something almost tender in picturing that work now, this far removed from it, men laboring through an English winter to prepare a ship for a colder one still to come, bracing every joint they could reach against a force none of them had personally felt, working from second-hand accounts of other ships that had gone north before and come back changed, or had not come back at all. If your eyes are already closing, let this part settle rather than sharpen. None of these details need to be held onto, only felt, the way the crew themselves might have felt the low hum of pipework beneath their boots on the first cold morning aboard. By the time the dry dock was flooded again and Terror settled back into the water at Chatham, she was, in almost every practical sense, a different ship from the one that had gone in. Heavier by a considerable margin, slower under sail than she had once been, her lines thickened with iron and her belly stiffened with new bracing, but built now specifically for a fight no gun could win for her. All that remained was to decide what such a ship, transformed at such expense and with such care, would actually need to carry inside her once she left Chatham behind for good. And that turned out to be a question almost as difficult as the refit itself. Chatham had given her a new spine, but a spine needs feeding, and what went into the two ships over the weeks that followed was its own kind of transformation, quieter than the ironwork, but just as total. You would have had to pick your way across the deck to get anywhere at all, because by the last fortnight there was barely deck left to walk on. Casks stood in ranks where the guns should have been. Crates waited their turn at the hatch covers, stacked 3 and 4 high, each one stenciled with a destination that did not yet exist on any chart worth trusting. If you had come aboard Erebus or Terror in those final weeks at anchor, the smell alone would have told you this was not a normal voyage being prepared. Under the pitch and the tar and the damp rope, there was tin and salt and something faintly sweet from the sealed cases of preserved meat, a smell that would still be there, unmoved, when men found those same cases more than a decade later, opened and empty, scattered across gravel 1,000 miles from anywhere. The tins themselves are worth pausing on because so much of what went wrong later would come to rest eventually on their seams. Tens of thousands of them went aboard the two ships, filled with meat and soup and vegetables, sealed by a contractor working against a deadline that left him little room to do the work as carefully as it deserved. Nobody loading those crates onto the deck that autumn had any way of knowing that. To the men carrying them up the gangway, a tin was simply the future, portioned out and stacked in the hold, proof that a voyage of years, not months, was something the age now believed itself capable of surviving. Alongside the tins went the coal, feeding the steam engines that had been dropped into each ship's hold, engines borrowed from railway locomotives and never meant for a life at sea, let alone a life in ice. And alongside the coal went the ordinary weight of any long voyage, barrels of salt beef and salt pork for when the tins ran low, casks of flour, endless small kegs of lime juice measured out against a disease the Navy had already learned at terrible cost on other voyages to fear more than any weather. But food and fuel were only half of what these ships were made to carry. And if you had stood at the foot of the gangway watching the crates go by, you might have been struck by how many of them held nothing you could eat or burn at all. There were libraries aboard both ships, real libraries, several hundred volumes apiece, chosen with the same seriousness the Navy gave to the instruments. There were hand organs that could be wound to play through a rotation of tunes, intended for the low months of total darkness when a ship, frozen fast in the ice, might otherwise have nothing to listen to but the ice itself, working against the hull. There were the instruments proper, chronometers, dip circles, barometers, equipment for taking magnetic readings that mattered enormously to a Royal Navy still trying to understand why compasses behaved so strangely this far north. Officers packed their own trunks alongside the Navy's crates, good china in some cases, and monogrammed silver, because a Franklin expedition, in the minds of the men who outfitted it, was still an occasion for a certain kind of civilized life to continue even at the edge of the mapped world. If your eyes are already closing, none of this detail needs to be held onto. It is enough to know that everything a floating community might need for years without resupply was carried up those two gangways, crate by crate, through a whole English autumn, and that the men doing the carrying believed almost without exception that they were about to become famous. That belief is worth sitting with a moment, because it shaped everything about who those men were and how they carried themselves aboard. A little over 120 of them sailed in total across the two ships, and the paperwork that survives gives you their trades in the flattest possible language. Able seamen, stokers, ice masters, surgeons, a clerk, a schoolmaster of sorts, engineers to tend the borrowed locomotive engines, but strip the flatness away and what you have is a small floating town, with its ranks and its rivalries and its private jokes, setting out for what almost everyone involved expected to be the crowning achievement of their careers. Officers wrote home about promotion. Sailors, many of them volunteers rather than pressed men, wrote home about the extra pay that came with polar service and the stories they would have to tell afterward, in whatever port they finally made landfall. There was, by every surviving account, remarkably little dread in those letters. This was an age that had already sent ships into the ice and gotten most of them back out again, and Franklin himself at 59 was sailing with the settled, unhurried confidence of a man who had done difficult things before and expected to do this one too, however long it took. But confidence, as anyone who has ever stood on a departing quay could tell you, does not sit evenly across a crew, and it is here that the story turns from the crates and the tins to something smaller and more private, tucked away in a handful of surviving letters that very few people bothered to read closely until long after both ships had gone quiet. Francis Crozier commanded Terror and had done so, or something very like it, on ice before. He had sailed south with James Clark Ross only a few years earlier, into waters colder and stranger than anything the Northwest Passage was likely to offer, and had come home from that voyage with his health more shaken than he ever fully admitted in public. He was Irish past his own middle years, unmarried after a proposal that had not gone the way he hoped, and by the time Terror lay ready at Greenhithe, he was second in command to a man he liked and respected, but did not, in his private letters, entirely share the mood of, where Franklin's correspondence in those last weeks reads almost buoyant, plans for the passage, thoughts on provisioning, the occasional dry joke about the weight of his own new decorations. Crozier's letters carry a different note underneath the same practical detail. He wrote to a friend of feeling tired before the voyage had even begun, of a low, persistent unease he could not entirely account for, of wondering, in a way Franklin never committed to paper, whether this expedition was truly as well found as everyone around him seemed to believe. It is a small thing, a handful of sentences in letters that survived more by luck than design, but it is the clearest window anyone now has into how differently two men standing on the decks of the same two ships could carry the same departure. None of that showed, of course, on the morning the ships actually left. Whatever quiet doubt Crozier carried, he carried it the way officers of his generation were trained to carry everything private, folded away behind the ordinary business of getting a ship underway. So what was it actually like that morning to watch two ships like these leave England for good, and who exactly was standing on the shore to see it? The Thames estuary in May of 1845 was crowded with more than gulls and gun smoke. Word had gone round, as it tends to with a departure this well publicised, and crowds gathered along the banks near Greenhithe to watch Erebus and Terror get underway, towed at first by steam tugs before they could make sail properly out past the Nore. If you had been standing among that crowd, craning to see past the shoulders in front of you, what would have reached you first would not have been the ships themselves but the noise, cheering certainly, and somewhere under it a band, and the ordinary clatter of a crowd that has come out for a spectacle and means to enjoy it. Franklin appears, in the accounts that survive, entirely equal to the moment, standing on deck in the kind of composed good humor that photographs badly want, but written descriptions supply generously. There is no surviving record of Crozier's face that morning, which is itself a small, telling absence in a story that would come to be full of them. The ships called briefly at Stromness in the Orkneys to take on fresh water and a final few provisions, and it was there, not off the Thames, that the very last letters home were written and handed ashore, the very last ordinary human messages: love to a sister, a request that a debt be settled, a note about the weather, that would ever leave those two hulls. A supply ship kept them company as far as the coast of Greenland, off the Whalefish Islands, and it was there, in early summer, that the final goodbyes were actually said. 5 officers sending letters back with the transport before Erebus and Terror struck out alone into water that grew, with every league west, less and less familiar to anyone aboard. A whaling captain spoke to them there too, the last man from the ordinary world who would ever report seeing them, moored to an iceberg, waiting for a lead to open in the pack, in perfectly good spirits, in no particular hurry, entirely unaware that he was about to become, without ever intending it, the final witness history would have. It is worth letting that image settle for a moment before the story moves on. Two ships, fully provisioned, fully manned, riding easily against an iceberg in bright summer light, watched by a whaler who waved and sailed on, certain, as everyone then was certain, that the next word anyone heard of Franklin's expedition would come from Franklin himself. Home again, the passage finally won. What came instead, and how long the waiting stretched before anyone in England was willing to call it what it was, is where this story has to go next. The image of that iceberg and the two ships riding easy beside it is the last clean photograph the historical record has to offer, and it is worth carrying with you as the ships sail on, because everything that follows happens just out of sight of anyone who might have written it down. You would have been at Stromness first if you had followed them from the start in the Orkney Islands, where Erebus and Terror took on their final water before the open sea, and where a few of the men wrote what turned out to be their last letters home, the ink still ordinary, the tone still cheerful, nothing in the handwriting to suggest that these were the last words their families would ever receive from them. From there, the ships crossed toward Greenland, and if you stood on the deck of the transport ship that had come with them that far, a supply vessel called the Barretto Junior, loaded down with the extra provisions the expedition did not yet need, you would have watched something almost domestic happen in the middle of the Atlantic. Crates and casks passed hand to hand between the hulls, tobacco and salt beef and preserved vegetables shifted from one deck to another, while a handful of men who had fallen ill or simply changed their minds were quietly transferred back onto the Barretto Junior to be carried home. 5 men left the expedition there at the Whalefish Islands off the coast of Greenland, and they are worth pausing on because they are the only members of Franklin's company whose stories do not end in the ice. Everyone else who crossed that anchorage in the summer of 1845 sailed on. You do not need to remember any of their names to feel the shape of what happened next. It is enough to sit with the fact that this was the last true harbor the expedition would ever see, the last place where a letter could still be posted, the last moment when turning back was still, in theory, a choice available to anyone aboard. From Disco Bay, the ships pushed into Baffin Bay, into water that grew colder and more crowded with ice the further west they went, and it is here that the story narrows to its final, precise point of contact with the world Franklin had left behind. Baffin Bay in high summer was not empty water. It was, in those years, one of the richest whaling grounds in the Northern Hemisphere, and English and Scottish whaling ships worked it every season, their crews as familiar with that stretch of ocean as any farmer was with his own fields. So it is not strange, and it did not strike anyone at the time as strange, that in late July of that year, 2 of those whaling vessels, the Prince of Wales, under a captain named Dannet, and another ship working nearby, came across Erebus and Terror moored against the edge of the pack, waiting, as ships often had to wait, for a channel to open in the ice ahead of them. You can imagine, if you like, what that meeting would have felt like from the deck of a whaler, though you do not have to imagine hard, because whaling captains met naval expeditions in those waters often enough that it barely counted as an occasion. Boats went between the ships. Men who had not seen a new face in weeks traded news, tobacco, perhaps a little drink, the ordinary currency of 2 crews meeting far from anywhere. Franklin's officers were in good spirits, by every account the whalers later gave. The ships were well provisioned, the men healthy, the mood unhurried, the kind of unhurried that comes from knowing you have years of stores in the hold, and no reason yet to feel the cold as anything other than an inconvenience. Someone aboard one of the whalers noted, without any sense that the detail would ever matter, that the expedition was simply waiting for the ice to loosen enough to let them continue west toward Lancaster Sound, toward the door into the passage they had come to find. And then the whalers sailed on, back toward the fishing grounds and eventually home, carrying with them, though none of them knew it, the final confirmed sighting of Sir John Franklin and every man under his command. Captain Crozier, over on Terror, would have been going through the same unhurried motions as Franklin's officers on Erebus, the ship's log kept, the watches set, the men occupied with whatever small repairs and small comforts a moored ship allows, waiting, like everyone else, for a lead to open in the ice ahead. So what was actually waiting for them once the whaling ships turned for home and Erebus and Terror sailed on alone into that ice? That question is where the story has to slow down, because from the moment those two ships lost sight of the Prince of Wales, the historical record does not simply thin out, it stops. There is no next letter. There is no next whaler's log entry, no next friendly encounter, no next voice from outside the expedition confirming that the ships were still afloat, still moving, still exactly where anyone expected them to be. Everything that happened to Franklin, Crozier, and the 126 men who sailed on with them after that summer afternoon in Baffin Bay would eventually have to be pieced together from other sources entirely, from cairns and bones and scraps of paper found years later, from stories carried by people who were never meant to be part of England's account of its own expedition at all. But that reconstruction belongs to later in this story. For now, you are simply here, at the edge of the known, watching two ships sail west into water that had never been properly charted, carrying with them the last clear image anyone in Europe would have of them for a very long time. It helps, if you are drifting a little already, to simply let this next part settle over you the way the ice itself would have settled over that water, not suddenly, but by degrees, until what had been open sea in July was something else entirely by September, because what lay beyond Baffin Bay was not simply more ocean. It was the entrance to the Northwest Passage as the Admiralty understood it, a tangle of straits and sounds and half-mapped channels running between islands that no European vessel had ever fully charted, some of them barely charted at all. Lancaster Sound opened the way in, wide and in a good year, navigable well into the ice-choked channels beyond. But what lay past it branched in directions that no one in London could describe with any real confidence. Franklin had his instructions, and they were sound as far as anyone's knowledge went at the time. But the truth underneath those instructions was that he was being sent to fill in a map that was mostly white space, guided by observations decades old and by guesses about currents and ice that would prove, in the years to come, to be badly wrong. You would have felt the difference the moment the ships left Baffin Bay behind, even if nothing about the sailing itself changed all at once. The water grew more crowded with ice that did not clear with the season the way it should have. The light, through the last of that Arctic summer, would have stretched long and strange across decks that were, for now, still dry and still busy, but the season was already turning beneath them faster than the charts or the instructions had prepared anyone to expect. Pack ice in that part of the Arctic does not arrive as a wall. It arrives as a tightening, flow joining to flow, lanes of open water narrowing week by week until a ship that was making good progress in August can find itself locked fast by the end of September, unable to move forward, unable to retreat, held in place by ice that will not release it again until the following summer, if then. This is the world Erebus and Terror sailed into once the whalers turned east. And it is worth sitting with how enormous that world actually was, not simply cold, not simply remote, but vast in a way that swallowed two three-masted ships as easily as it might have swallowed two rowing boats. There was no coastline nearby to mark their progress by, in the way there had been at Stromness or Disco Bay. There was ice and open water where the ice allowed it, and islands whose outlines existed on the Admiralty's charts more as suggestion than certainty. Franklin was not sailing toward a known destination. He was sailing into a blank space with instructions to make it less blank, and the last people who could confirm exactly how he was doing that were the whaling crews who had already turned for home. And so the silence begins, quietly, the way silences of this kind always seem to begin, not as an alarm but simply as an absence that no one yet has any reason to worry about. Ships on expeditions like this one were expected to vanish from communication for a season or two. That was understood, planned for, built into the way both the Admiralty and the families back home thought about a voyage of this kind. A year without word was ordinary. Even 2 years, If the passage proved as difficult as everyone expected it might, would not have seemed cause for panic, not at first, not to men who had read their history and knew how long such expeditions could take when the ice had its own opinion about the schedule. What no one in England understood yet, and what would take far longer than anyone could have imagined for them to even begin to understand, was how completely and how permanently that silence was about to settle in. Two ships that had been seen clearly, cheerfully, riding easy against an iceberg in the bright light of a Baffin Bay summer were about to disappear from the confirmed record so thoroughly that it would take the better part of a decade, and the patient, doubted testimony of people the Admiralty had never thought to fully trust before anyone in London had a clear idea of what had actually become of them. That waiting, and the shape it took, and the people who bore the weight of it longest, is where the story goes next. You would not have needed to be a sailor's wife in that first winter after the ships went dark to feel that something had gone quiet that should not be quiet. England kept its own rhythm regardless of the ice. The shipping notices still ran in the papers, the coffee houses still argued about tariffs and railways, and if you had walked down to the Admiralty on any ordinary Tuesday, you would have found clerks moving paper with the same unhurried indifference they gave to every other overdue vessel. A voyage into the Arctic was expected to swallow a year, sometimes two, without a letter home. There was no cause yet for anyone to raise their voice. You could stand in that hush and mistake it, quite reasonably, for patience rather than dread. But patience has a shelf life, and by the second winter it had begun to sour into something else. The whalers who worked the edges of Baffin Bay each summer, the only Europeans who ever came near those waters, returned with nothing, no sighting, no note left in a cairn, no word passed along by other ships. You feel the shift less as an event than as a texture, the way a room changes temperature before anyone says a word about the cold. Letters that had once asked cheerfully after the Franklin's garden began, without quite admitting it, to ask after the expedition instead. And at the center of that slowly gathering unease sat a woman the Admiralty had badly underestimated. Lady Jane Franklin was not a woman built for waiting rooms. She had crossed deserts and climbed mountains before she ever became a captain's wife, and the same restlessness that had carried her up the Nile now turned itself, with total and unglamorous persistence, against the lords of the Admiralty. She wrote. She wrote to admirals, to newspaper editors, to anyone in government who might still answer a letter from a woman whose husband was, officially, merely late. When official patience proved to be exactly as slow as official patience always is, she did not wait for it to move. She spent her own money, a great deal of it, more than most families of the age would ever see in a lifetime, funding search vessels of her own, chartering ships the Navy had not yet agreed to send, because agreement, she had already learned, could take years she was not willing to spend in a drawing room. If your image of a grieving Victorian wife is someone who wrings her hands by a window, set it down. This was a woman who read charts. It would take the better part of a decade for London to fully match her urgency, and even then it was her pressure, more than any single officer's conscience, that kept the search alive when it might easily have quietly lapsed. She outlived the polite fiction that her husband might simply reappear one summer, weathered and apologetic. She outlived, too, the Admiralty's early insistence that the ice would sort itself out, that men like Sir John Franklin did not simply vanish. And she never stopped asking the one question that official patience kept trying to set aside, not whether the expedition might return, but where, precisely, anyone had actually looked. That question deserves an honest answer, because a search across Arctic water is not the sort of thing that resembles a search anywhere else. What does it even mean to look for two ships in a place like that, where the coastline itself keeps rearranging under pack ice, where the same channel that lies open in July can be sealed solid by September, and where a search vessel's own crew might spend a winter locked in the very ice they came to search? It helps to picture it not as searching a landscape, but as searching a landscape that keeps closing behind you. The first hard answer to Lady Franklin's question came not from a grand naval expedition, but from a smaller party working its way along the coast of Beechy Island, low, bare, and unremarkable, the kind of place a passing ship might not trouble to name. And it was there, on ground that gave up nothing willingly, that the searchers found the first physical proof that Erebus and Terror had ever existed at all beyond a hopeful letter home. You can imagine the moment more easily than you might expect. Men picking across frozen gravel, expecting driftwood or nothing, and finding instead the unmistakable geometry of a grave marker standing where no grave marker should be. There were 3 of them in the end, wooden headboards planted in ground so hard it must have taken the crew days to open, each one carved with a name, a rank, a date early in the expedition's very first winter. Around them lay the debris of a camp that had clearly meant to be temporary. Tins, scraps of canvas, the remains of a small garden someone had apparently tried to grow in tubs of Arctic soil, as if the ships had paused there expecting spring to behave the way it did at home. There was no message, no care note explaining where the ships had gone next, though searchers dug and searched with a thoroughness that left little room to think they had simply missed it. 3 men dead before the first winter was even finished, and after that, silence again, as complete as the silence that had swallowed the ships from the start. News of Beechey Island reached London and changed the shape of the search entirely. This was no longer a matter of whether something had gone wrong. It was now a matter of how much and how many. Word of it would have reached you if you had been standing anywhere near a naval dock in those years, less as an announcement than as a kind of held breath passed from crew to crew. 3 graves found, no ships, no further trace, the expedition's own men clearly having believed at that first winter's end that they still had every reason to go on. What followed was not one expedition, but a small navy's worth of them, spread out across a decade of summers, funded by turns by the Admiralty, by the merchant houses, and by Lady Franklin's own steadily thinning purse. Ships with names like Assistance and Investigator threaded the same channels Erebus and Terror had vanished into, sometimes finding themselves iced in for a winter of their own, their crews scattered across sledge parties that walked distances, which would sound implausible if you had not already learned, by then, just how far men in that service were willing to walk on short rations and worse ice. Men numbering in the hundreds gave years of their working lives to this single question. If you had watched them depart, one expedition after another, you might have thought the whole of the Navy had quietly decided that finding 2 ships mattered more than anything else afloat. And in a sense, it did, at least for a while. Not out of sentiment alone, but because an empire that prided itself on knowing every coastline in the world found it difficult to admit that a piece of its own fleet had disappeared into water it claimed to have already charted. You do not have to hold any of these names in your memory to feel the shape of what they were doing. Let this part settle over you the way it must have settled over London itself, as a slow, uncomfortable, very expensive kind of not knowing. Yet for all that effort, for all those ships and all those winters spent locked in ice on someone else's behalf, the searches of that first long decade answered almost nothing beyond the fact of the graves themselves. They confirmed that the expedition had wintered at Beechey, that 3 men had died there, and that after that first winter, the ships had moved on to somewhere the search parties could not follow with the tools and the assumptions they had brought with them. Where Erebus and Terror had gone afterward, what had become of the rest of the crews, whether any had survived the encounter with that coastline at all, none of it lay written on Beechey Island's frozen ground. The deeper fate of the ships remained exactly as sealed as it had been the day the whalers lost sight of them, and the answer, when it finally came, would not come from another Navy ship threading those same channels at all. It would come from people the search parties had already met more than once, without ever quite believing what they were being told. Some of those searchers had already stood face to face with the very people who knew the answer and had walked away with nothing written in their notebooks worth keeping. There is a particular kind of not listening that has nothing to do with distance or language, and everything to do with what a man has already decided is possible before he opens his mouth to ask a question. You can picture it easily enough if you have ever watched someone nod through an answer they had no intention of believing. Naval officers came ashore in their heavy coats through interpreters who were themselves often guessing, and put questions to Inuit hunters about ships and white men to the south and west, and were told more than once of a place where 2 large boats had been seen, of men who had walked inland and did not walk back, of graves and gear scattered along a shore no expedition had thought to search. And then, having heard it, they thanked their hosts, wrote a polite line in a log, and returned to searching the same water they had already failed to find anything in. It would be easy, from the comfort of a bed on some ordinary night generations later, to call this simple prejudice and leave it at that, and you would not be entirely wrong. But it was also something closer to a failure of imagination, an insistence that knowledge about the Arctic could only be trusted if it arrived in English, on a ship, wearing a uniform. That insistence would cost the search the better part of a century, and it began quietly on beaches where the truth had already been spoken aloud more than once to men who simply were not ready to hear it. The land keeps its own records, and in the spring after the ships went silent, that record was already being written in the only ink the Arctic allows. Footprints in old snow, cut marks on bone, a story passed from one mouth to another around a lamp. You would not have found it in London. You would have found it here, on the gravel beaches of King William Island, where a hunting party crossed paths with something they did not expect and never quite forgot. Picture it the way it must have looked to them. A line of men on the ice, too many to be a normal traveling party, moving with the particular unsteadiness of people who have not eaten enough in a long time. If you had been standing where the hunters stood, you would have seen the strangeness before you understood it. Coats the wrong shape for this country, faces gone the grey colour that cold and hunger both leave behind, a silence where there should have been greeting. Some of the men pulled a boat behind them on a sledge, though there was no open water anywhere near. That detail alone would have told you these were people who did not know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. The hunters gave what they could. This was not sentiment. It was simply what the land required of anyone who found another person starving on it. Some meat was traded, a little seal fat, whatever could be spared from stores that were never generous to begin with. And then, because the world of the ice is not a large one and news travels along its edges the way sound travels along a frozen lake, word of this passed from camp to camp, family to family, through the following seasons. A story about Kalunat, white men walking south from somewhere no one could quite place, and not walking well. Other pieces followed in their own time. Hunters came across a place where a ship had been crushed, or sunk, or simply left to the ice's patience. The accounts differed in their particulars the way any set of eyewitness accounts will differ, though they agreed oddly on the shape of the disaster itself. There were tools left behind and metal, and in at least one telling, bodies in a boat, and further along, more bodies, some in a tent, some simply where they had stopped walking and had not started again. None of this was rumor in the way the word is usually meant. It was testimony, carried carefully, the way people carry things they understand to be important even when they cannot yet know why. You do not need to hold every detail of this in your mind tonight. Let it settle instead the way it settled into the oral record of the people who kept it, not as a puzzle to be solved immediately, but as a fact of the land, filed away until someone came asking the right questions. Someone did come eventually, and his name was John Ray. If his name feels familiar to you already, that is because it should. He is the same surveyor whose maps had been quietly closing the gaps in that coastline for years. The same patient man who preferred a sledge and a small party to a fleet of ships. In the spring of 1854, working his own survey far south and west of where the Admiralty had ever thought to look, Ray met a hunter who would give the search its first real answer. The man's name, as Ray wrote it down, was Inuit, and what he offered was not a legend but an inventory. Silver forks and spoons engraved with initials that did not belong to him. A small silver plate, a naval button, the kind of objects that had clearly not been made anywhere near this coast. He had not seen the ships himself. He was telling Ray what others had told him, in the way a whole community holds a story between many keepers rather than trusting it to one. Ray listened, which matters more than it should. He wrote down what he was told with the same care he gave to a coastline he was charting for the first time, understanding, as few of his countrymen did, that a report carried faithfully across several tellings was still a report, not a rumor to be waved away. What he heard in outline was this. A large party of white men, perhaps as many as 40, had been seen dragging boats south along the western shore of the island some winters before, thin, exhausted, some of them dying as they walked. And later still their bodies had been found, some in a boat, some scattered along the route, in a manner the hunters described with a bluntness that had nothing of embellishment in it. It was not a kind story. It did not need to be improved to be terrible. You can imagine, if you let yourself, what it must have taken to sit with that account and then to carry it home across an ocean, knowing it would be the first solid word England had received in years about ships that had sailed out so proudly. Ray did carry it home. He wrote his report, attached the relics as proof, and delivered both to the Admiralty, believing, reasonably, that the search was over in every sense that mattered, that the fate of the expedition had finally been told by the only people who actually knew it. But knowing a thing and having it believed are not always the same event, and here the story turns, the way these stories so often do, on the simple, stubborn matter of who was allowed to be trusted. Because the Admiralty did not want Ray's answer, and more particularly, it did not want the manner in which the answer had arrived. A report built from Inuit testimony, however carefully recorded, however consistent across many independent tellings, was received in London less as evidence and more as an insult to the men it described. And there was one detail in Ray's account that made the insult sharper still. The hunters had spoken of something worse than starvation among the last of the party, a suggestion that in the final desperate stretch the living had resorted to eating the dead. It is the kind of detail that should have been weighed as testimony and was instead treated as slander. Lady Franklin, whose long vigil you have already sat through with her in the chapters before this one, was among the loudest in rejecting it, understandably unwilling to accept such an account of her husband's men without a fight, and unwilling, too, to accept that the fight might already be lost. But it was not only grief speaking. The wider public took up the argument with a kind of appetite that had little to do with evidence at all. Charles Dickens, writing at length and with considerable relish, dismissed the Inuit witnesses outright, suggesting that their character made them unreliable narrators of anything, let alone the deaths of British officers, that the word of, in his phrase, a race of savages should not be weighed against the honor of Englishmen. It was cruel, and it was wrong on its own terms, since nothing in Ray's careful notes suggested people inventing a story. It suggested people repeating with unusual consistency something they had genuinely seen and genuinely found. Ray defended his report and defended the men who had given it to him, and it cost him, in the way honesty about uncomfortable truths so often costs the person who delivers it. He never received the full credit the search establishment might have given a British naval officer who had solved the same mystery, and he watched the story he had brought home get folded into a version of events more comfortable for London to tell itself, one in which noble Englishmen had perished nobly, rather than one in which they had died as anyone dies of cold and hunger, and had been found and understood by exactly the people best equipped in the whole world to understand them. What is quietly remarkable, turning it over now, is how much of what those Inuit witnesses said would eventually prove accurate down to details the searchers of the time could not have imagined checking. The direction of the walk, the location of a wrecked ship, the manner of the men's decline, all of it sat waiting in testimony that had been offered freely more than once to searchers who simply were not prepared to write it into the official record as fact. It would take longer than any of those searchers could have guessed for that account to be honored properly, and the shape of that reckoning belongs to a much later part of this story, waiting patiently of its own accord, the way the ice itself was waiting, somewhere further south along that same cold coast that Ray had only begun to chart. Other travelers followed Ray's path in the years after, and each of them, if they troubled to ask, heard something close to the same account, offered by people who had no reason to keep inventing a lie that cost them nothing to tell truthfully. Charles Francis Hall, an American who spent years living among Inuit families rather than passing briefly through, gathered testimony of his own, new details this time, about a place where men had fallen and not risen, about metal and wood scattered along a shoreline that no British search party had yet thought to walk. You might notice, if you were tallying it in the dark the way one tallies sheep, how often these separate tellings agreed on the same stretch of coast, the same direction of travel, the same grim particulars repeated by people who had never met one another and had no way to coordinate a story. It was there in Hall's notebooks, waiting the way it had waited in Ray's. It would still be waiting when a company clerk named William Gibson, and later a search of a very different kind, finally turned toward Victory Point to see what the walking men had left behind. Victory Point is not much to look at even now. A low shoulder of gravel and frost-shattered stone facing water that is choked with ice more months than it is open. There is nothing grand about it, nothing that announces itself as the place where an empire's certainty finally ran out. If you stood there today, boots sinking slightly in the tundra moss, you would feel the wind first, then notice the cairn, a modest pile of stones, man-built, out of place among the natural rubble around it. You would have to look twice to see that someone had once stacked those stones on purpose, and that whatever they left beneath them had waited there, through storm after storm, for longer than most nations managed to hold a single shape. It waited through the search parties who walked past without looking closely enough. It waited through the years when Lady Franklin was still writing letters, still funding expeditions, still refusing every polite suggestion that she stop. And it waited through the accounts brought back by Inuit hunters and by John Ray, all of which pointed toward this general country, this general stretch of coast, without ever quite landing on the cairn itself. You do not need to hold any of this too tightly. It is enough for now to know that something had been left here, deliberately, by men who understood they might not survive to see it read. When a search party finally did open that cairn, what they found inside was a single sheet of paper folded around a printed naval form, the kind meant for brief, routine notices, the sort a ship might drop overboard in a sealed bottle just to mark its passage. It had never been designed to carry what it ended up carrying. The first message written on it, dated in the spring after the ships had gone into the ice, was almost cheerfully unremarkable. All well, it said, in effect, wintered off an island, ready to proceed. It was the kind of note a captain writes when he expects someone someday to read it as a footnote rather than an epitaph, but scrawled around the margins of that same sheet, added later in a different hand and a different mood entirely, was a second message. And this is the one that matters. The one search parties had been hoping and dreading to find for the better part of a decade. It told you, in the clipped language of a ship's officer trying to fit catastrophe into the white space around a printed form, that the ships had been abandoned, that they had been beset in ice for close to 2 winters running, unable to break free, the men aboard slowly running down like a clock nobody had thought to wind. It told you that Sir John Franklin had died, the date given with the same flat precision as everything else on the page, no more elaborated upon than a note about the weather. And it told you, in a line that must have taken something out of whoever wrote it, that command had passed to Francis Crozier, the same Crozier who had sailed as second in command from the very beginning, steady, experienced, the sort of officer the Admiralty trusted precisely because he never asked to be trusted with anything more than what the situation required. Now the situation required everything. You could read that whole note in under a minute, and people have spent the better part of 2 centuries doing exactly that, turning the same handful of sentences over and over, looking for what they don't say, as much as for what they do. There is no drama in the handwriting, no underlining, no exclamation, just a captain's log reduced to its barest surviving fragment, and behind that fragment more than 100 men who had already decided, by the time the second message was written, that their only remaining chance lay not in the ships anymore, but in their own legs. That decision is where the story turns, and it is worth pausing here, gently, before it does, because what came after the note is harder to hold on to than what came before it. There are no more messages after this one. No further cairns, no further forms tucked into bottles or under stones. From this point on, the expedition speaks to us only through what its men happened to drop, or carry, or leave lying where they fell, scattered across a landscape that kept almost none of it safe and gave almost none of it back easily. So what happened to the men who walked away from that note once it was written and the cairn was sealed behind them? They set out south, along the coast, dragging boats mounted on heavy sledges, an arrangement that must have seemed reasonable in a planning room in London and became something closer to a slow punishment once it met the actual ice. You can picture the line of them, if you let yourself, strung out across the gravel and the frozen shore, ropes over their shoulders, breath fogging in front of faces that had not seen anything but ice and each other for the better part of 2 years. They were making, according to every later reconstruction, for a river mouth on the mainland, a known route, a plausible way home. It was not an unreasonable plan. It was simply too far, attempted by men who no longer had the strength that such a distance required. What they left behind them tells the story better than any letter could have, because it was never meant to be a story at all. It was simply debris, the ordinary residue of desperate people trying to lighten their own load. Search parties in later decades, walking the same shoreline the crew had walked, found silver cutlery engraved with officers' initials, abandoned as though weight mattered more than any claim to status. They found boots, standing upright where men had stepped out of them and simply kept walking in whatever remained. They found a boat, set upon its heavy sledge and pointed oddly back the way the men had already come, with 2 skeletons inside it and a scatter of supplies around them that made no clear sense to anyone who examined it. Chocolate and slippers and other items that read now less like survival gear and more like the choices of men whose judgment had begun to fail them long before their strength did. And they found remains, scattered along miles of that coast, some gathered later into cairns of their own, some left where the land had taken them, a scattering that later study would connect to exposure, to scurvy, to the slow arithmetic of starvation, and eventually, controversially, to something else again. Cut marks on certain bones that pointed toward cannibalism in the expedition's final desperate weeks, a possibility so unwelcome to Victorian sensibilities that when Ray first reported it based on Inuit testimony, it cost him a knighthood and cost the Inuit witnesses their credibility in London drawing rooms for the better part of a century. You already know from earlier in this story how that particular injustice played out, and there is no need to walk back through it here. It is enough to say that the bones agreed eventually with what the hunters had always said. Crozier's name appears nowhere in that debris. No engraved cutlery marked with his initials has ever been recovered, no cairn built specifically in his memory, no remains identified with any confidence as his own. He is the last officer the record names with certainty, the man who signed the second message, who took command of however many men still stood, who apparently led them out onto the ice and off the edge of every written account that survives. Whether he died early in the march or late, whether he reached the mainland or never came close, whether he lived long enough to regret the decision to leave the ships at all, none of it is answered by anything that has ever been found. Inuit testimony gathered by Hall and by others would later describe a tall, older officer surviving longer than most, traveling with a small remaining party, though whether that figure was Crozier himself has never been settled past reasonable doubt. He simply walks out of the paper record and into rumor, and rumor is a country with very soft borders. If your eyes are already closing, that is exactly the right place to leave him. Not resolved, not found, simply walking, the way he has been walking in the retelling of this story for longer than his own actual life lasted. What is certain, and what closes this chapter more firmly than Crozier's fate ever will, is that after Victory Point, the expedition disappears from written history almost entirely. No further logs, no further notes in cairns, no confirmed sighting of a single living member of the crew by anyone who left a European written account. The ships themselves, Erebus and Terror, the 2 vessels that had carried all of this ambition into the ice in the first place, simply vanish from the record at the same moment their men do, last described as beset and abandoned somewhere off the coast, their final position never pinned down by anyone who wrote it in English. For more than a century and a half, that is where the paper trail simply stops. A note in a cairn, a scatter of bones and boots and silverware along a gravel shore, and two ships that no one could say with any confidence still existed at all. It would take voices outside that paper trail, voices that had been telling a consistent, patient story all along, long before any Englishman thought to write it down, to eventually close that gap. And it would take one man in particular, walking this same coast generations later with his grandmother's stories in his ears, instead of a naval chart in his hands, to begin turning rumor back into geography. The years did what years do. They did not so much end the search as let it go slack, the way a held breath finally releases when there is nothing left to hold it for. Britain sent ships out for a decade and more after the note in the cairn was found, hunting not for survivors now. No one still believed in survivors, but for confirmation, for wreckage, for something more than boots and buttons and a scatter of bones along a gravel shore. And when even that hunting thinned to almost nothing, the story did not disappear. It changed shape instead. It stopped being a rescue and became a legend, and legends, once they set, are difficult to move. You can feel that change happen if you sit with the newspapers of the period, the way you might sit now with the dark settled around you and nothing left to do but listen. The early notices are urgent, full of verbs, searching, citing, hoping. The later ones slow down. They become memorial. Franklin's name moves from the front page to the stone plaque, from the naval dispatch to the poem, from a man who might yet be found to a man who was mourned. There is a kind of ship, you might say, that never has to sink to be lost. It only has to stop being looked for. Lady Jane Franklin did not stop looking, not for a long while. You may remember her from earlier in this story, funding expedition after expedition out of her own pocket and her own stubbornness, refusing the Admiralty's quiet suggestion that her husband be struck from the list of the living years before she was ready to hear it. She spent much of what she had, and much of what remained of her life, chasing an answer that kept arriving in fragments too small to make a whole truth. By the time she died, an old woman with the case still technically unresolved, the search had already become something closer to memory than to mission. The nation had built its monument to Franklin before it had ever found his ship, which tells you something about how a legend and a fact can drift apart and still be spoken of in the same breath, as though they were the same thing. And underneath the legend, quietly, the two ships themselves simply were not there. Not in any record anyone in London trusted. Erebus and Terror had become words in an inscription, names on a stone in a cathedral, characters in a story whose ending had been agreed upon. The ice, the illness, the long walk south, the silence, without the physical proof of a hull ever being produced. Search parties had returned with relics, a piece of a boat, a broken sledge, a scrap of uniform. They had not returned with a ship. And as the decades wore past, that absence stopped feeling like an open question and started feeling like a permanent condition. The way you might stop noticing that a room has been missing a piece of furniture for so long that the empty space simply becomes the shape of the room. The Inuit testimony that had touched on the ships, the accounts of vessels seen crushed in the ice, of one ship still afloat and boarded by hunters before it sank, of shapes glimpsed under clear winter water, had been heard by search officers, written down here and there in journals and reports, and then largely set aside. You already know some of this from earlier in the telling, how those voices were doubted, softened, or simply left out of the official account because the men writing the official account could not quite bring themselves to build a British tragedy out of testimony they considered unreliable. So, the words survived technically in a handful of expedition journals gathering dust in London. But as living, active knowledge anyone was still using to look for anything, they had gone quiet. Filed. Forgotten in the particular way that only paperwork can forget something, by keeping it and never opening it again. But quiet in one place does not mean quiet everywhere. If the story had gone still in London, drifting into brass plaques and mourning verse, You might ask where else it could possibly have been kept alive at all, and the answer is that it had never stopped being alive, not 50 miles from where the ships themselves had gone down. In the small communities scattered along that coast, among people whose families had been traveling and hunting that ice for longer than Britain had possessed a navy, the story of the two ships and the dying strangers had never become a legend in the way the word is usually meant. It had never hardened into monument or verse. It had simply been kept, the way a family keeps the shape of a bad winter, or the location of a good fishing channel, or the name of a grandfather, passed mouth to ear, generation folding into generation, carried by people who had every reason to remember precisely because remembering correctly mattered. If you had been sitting in one of those homes on a long, dark evening, not unlike this one, you might have heard the story told the way any important story is told there. Carefully, without exaggeration, checked against what the elders themselves had heard from elders before them, treated less as an old tale than as a kind of inherited map. That is worth sitting with for a moment, in the dark, without any urgency attached to it. Two entirely different systems for keeping the truth of what happened to those men had been running in parallel for a very long time, one written down in ship's logs and admiralty files and newspaper columns, the other spoken, tested and re-spoken across kitchen tables and skin tents and sled journeys, checked each time against memory rather than paper. The first system had run out of road. It had said everything it was going to say and had settled into its plaques and its poems. The second had not run out of anything. It was still being told quietly, correctly, by people the first system had never seriously asked. You do not need to hold on to any of the details of this yet. Let it simply sit there, the way it sat for 100 years and more. Two ships known by name in one culture's memory and known by exact location, or something close to it, in another's, and no bridge yet built between the two. The people who carried this story were not historians in the way the word gets used in London. They were hunters, mothers, elders, people whose authority over the story came not from a university chair, but from the simple, unbroken fact of having heard it correctly from someone who had heard it correctly before them. There is no single name attached to this custodianship, no one figure standing in for it, because that is not how it worked. It worked the way a hearth is kept, tended by whoever is nearest it, passed without ceremony from one pair of hands to the next. A grandmother telling a boy about ships crushed in the ice long before he had ever seen a chart of that coastline. An uncle pointing toward a stretch of water and saying simply that something large still lay there, the way his own uncle had told him. None of it written, all of it, somehow, still exact. It is worth noticing what was not happening during all those quiet decades. No expedition came to ask. No official record was kept of who remembered what, or how reliably. The story sat in the mouths of people the search had already stopped listening to, ripening in its own way, waiting the way ice waits, not dramatically, not urgently. Simply present, season after season, whether or not anyone from the outside world thought to come and ask about it. It would take a long while yet before anyone did ask properly, before someone stood in one of those communities not as a naval officer collecting testimony to be doubted, but as someone who already believed the story before he heard it told, because it was, in part, his own. And when that finally happened, it happened through a boy who grew up listening to exactly this kind of memory, not treating it as folklore to be politely noted and set aside, but as a record every bit as precise, in its own way, as anything written in a ship's log. That boy would grow into a man with a name worth remembering, unlike so many of the voices that came before him and were never written down at all. And it is to him, and to the patient, unglamorous work he began, that this story now has to turn. He was not, at first, a searcher in any way the word usually implies. He was simply a boy in a small community north of the mainland, the kind of place where the wind off the strait tells you more about tomorrow than any forecast could, and where a grandmother's voice after supper carried as much weight as anything printed. You can picture him there without needing to picture very much at all. A table, a lamp, the particular quiet of a household settling in for the night, and an old woman speaking without hurry about ships that had gone under the ice long before his own parents were born. He did not write any of it down. He did not need to. That was, after all, the entire point of how the knowledge had survived this long. It lived in attention, not in ink. What made him different from other children who heard the same stories was not talent exactly, and not luck, but a kind of patience that would take decades to show its shape. He began quietly, and without any plan that could be called a plan, to ask more questions than the story usually invited, not to challenge it, only to understand it better than anyone before him ever had reason to. The years did the rest of the work quietly, the way they tend to. Louis Kamukak grew into a grown man of Joa Haven, married, working, raising a family of his own, and somewhere inside all of that ordinary life, the questions he had started asking as a boy never really stopped. You could imagine him, if you like, at a kitchen table with a notebook and a tape recorder, patient in the particular way that only people who already know the whole of their lives will be spent on one task can be patient. There is nothing urgent in this part of the story. If your eyes are already closing, let them. This is the kind of work that happens slowly, in rooms with tea going cold, and it will still be there when you drift back in. What he did, across more than 3 decades, sounds almost too plain to call a life's work. He visited elders. He sat with them, sometimes for an afternoon, sometimes across many visits spread over years, and he listened to the stories that had already been told to him as a child, except now he listened differently. He was no longer simply receiving a story the way you receive a blanket passed down for warmth. He was turning it over, asking where exactly, asking who told you this, asking what your grandmother called that place and why. You can picture him leaning in close over a table lit by a single lamp, the elder across from him speaking unhurried Inuinaktun or Inuktitut, and Kamukak writing not to capture poetry, but to capture geography. Because that was the thing almost no one from outside had ever quite understood. The stories were not decoration. They were coordinates, dressed in the clothing of memory. A hunter's account of a strange, blackened wreck seen years before his own birth was not folklore to be admired and set aside. It was a location, described the only way a people without written charts had ever needed to describe a location, by the shape of the coastline nearby, by the name of a bay. By the season, the ice had been thin enough to see something dark beneath it. Kamukak had grown up inside that system of memory. What he did with his adult life was learn to translate it outward, into a form that the world beyond Joa Haven might actually be able to use. He was, by trade and temperament, an amateur historian in the oldest and least dismissive sense of that word. Someone who does the work for love, without a university funding it, without an institution behind him at the start. He read. He read every account of the old British search expeditions he could get his hands on, the journals and reports written by naval officers who had come through these waters more than a century before him, hunting for Franklin's ships and Franklin's men. And here is where his particular kind of mind showed itself, because most people who had read those old reports read them as history, closed the book, and moved on. Kamukak read them as a second set of testimony, one that had to be laid over the first. He began, in effect, to build 2 maps at once and see where they touched. On one side, the place names his own people had always used, the ones his grandmother and the old hunters spoke without a second thought. Names that described a shoreline the way you might describe a room you have lived in your whole life, by feel rather than by measurement. On the other side, the clumsy, transliterated place names the British search parties had scratched into their own journals, half heard from Inuit guides through interpreters who themselves barely had enough language to manage the crossing. For most readers, those old British journals full of garbled native words were simply a nuisance, a place where the record went dim. For Kamukak, they were the seam where 2 languages had once briefly touched the same landscape, and if you were patient enough and knew both sides well enough, you could find the place where the seam lined up. You do not have to hold any of the details of this in your mind to feel the shape of it. Picture instead the simple, unglamorous truth of the work. A man in his own community, unpaid for most of it, driving or walking to visit elders who were themselves growing old, carrying a tape recorder that by today's standards would look almost quaint, asking the same patient questions over years the outside world had already stopped asking. There was no rescue crew standing behind him, no ship, no funding body, no expedition. There was a kitchen table, a landscape he had known his whole life, and a stubborn belief that everything anyone needed to know had already been said more than once by people whose names would never appear in a naval log. But what does it actually take, you might ask, to turn a family's spoken memory into a place a search vessel could sail toward with any confidence at all? It is one thing to be told a wreck sank near a certain point of land generations ago. It is another thing entirely to turn that into coordinates precise enough to matter, and that gap between the two is where most of Kamukak's quiet decades were actually spent. He began cross-referencing everything he gathered against whatever charts and older accounts he could find, comparing testimony collected by 19th century searchers, men like Charles Francis Hall and Frederick Schwatka, who had themselves interviewed Inuit witnesses decades after the ships vanished, against the versions of those same stories still circulating in Joa Haven in his own lifetime. Some of you may remember from earlier in this telling the Inuit hunters and elders those searchers spoke with, men whose accounts of a ship seen standing in the ice or a wreck later found broken on a shore had been recorded, then largely set aside by a wider world more comfortable trusting a British officer's compass than an Inuit family's memory. Kamukak went looking for the descendants of exactly those witnesses. He wanted to know if the story his own family told matched, in its bones, what a hunter's grandmother had told a whaling captain more than 100 years before. Often, remarkably, it did. This was not glamorous archaeology. There was no digging, no diving, not yet. It was archival work of the most patient kind, conducted as much in living rooms as in libraries, and it required Kamukak to hold two very different kinds of record in his head at once, and trust that both were telling something true. The old British journals gave him names, half transliterated, spelled inconsistently, sometimes contradicting each other from one officer's account to the next. The oral testimony gave him a living, continuous thread, unbroken across the generations, tied to the actual land the way the British accounts gathered second-hand and departed on the next ship north never quite could be. He spent years simply building a gazetteer in his own mind and notebooks, matching a modern point on a modern chart to an old Inuit place name, and then matching that place name again to whatever a 19th century search party had garbled it into. Slowly, out of that unglamorous cross-referencing, a pattern began to settle into shape, the way sediment settles once the water above it finally goes still. Certain locations kept recurring. Different elders, unrelated to one another, separated by a generation or more, would describe the same stretch of coastline, the same strange sighting, the same detail about a mast or a hull glimpsed through ice, using different words but pointing. When Kamukak laid their accounts side by side at the same patch of water, it is a small, quiet thing to feel a pattern emerge like that, nothing like a discovery in the dramatic sense, more like watching fog thin over a shoreline you already suspected was there. And this, more than anything else, became Kamukak's quiet conviction, the belief he carried through decades of unpaid, unglamorous work and never really abandoned, that the location of Franklin's ships had not, in any real sense, been lost at all. It had been known and spoken of within Inuit families the entire time, passed the way all their most important knowledge was passed, through attention rather than ink, waiting only for someone willing to listen carefully enough and for long enough to hear it as geography rather than legend. He was not a man given to grand claims, and he never framed his own work as heroic. If anything, he seemed faintly puzzled that it needed doing at all, that a story his own grandmother could have told a stranger in an afternoon had taken the wider world more than a century to take seriously. But by the time new searchers began arriving in the north again, in ships fitted with instruments no 19th century officer could have imagined, it was Kamukak's quiet decades of listening that gave them somewhere to actually point those instruments. The maps he had built from tea-table conversations and old naval journals were about to meet for the first time a search that finally had the technology to go looking exactly where he had always said to look. But before any of that could happen, there was still the matter of who might actually listen, and that part of the story moved slower than Kamukak would have liked. He wrote letters. He spoke at conferences when he was invited, which was not often, to rooms of archaeologists and historians who were polite, sometimes genuinely curious, but rarely in a hurry to redraw a search area on his say-so alone. You can picture him standing at the edge of those rooms afterward, answering questions from the 2 or 3 people who had actually leaned forward during his talk, while the rest filed out toward the coffee. It would take one particular archaeologist, more stubborn or more open than the others, to change the shape of what came next. It would take one particular archaeologist, more stubborn or more open than the others, to change the shape of what came next. His name was Marc-André Bernier, and he ran Parks Canada's small underwater archaeology team, the kind of unit that spends most of its budget on diesel and most of its year waiting for a short window of open water. You would not have picked him out in a crowd as the man who would end 160 years of searching. He looked, by most accounts, like exactly what he was: a careful, unhurried person who preferred a chart to a headline. But somewhere in the stack of reports that crossed his desk, Louis Kamukak's name kept appearing, attached to testimony that other searchers had filed away and mostly forgotten. Bernier read it differently. He read it the way you might read a letter from someone who had never once lied to you before, and he began, quietly, to build a search around it rather than around it. That is the hinge this whole story turns on, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before the ships go out. For a century and a half, every search had started from the written word, Franklin's orders, the Admiralty's charts, Crozier's last known heading, and had treated the Inuit accounts as something to be checked against that record and usually found wanting. Now, for what seems to have been the first time with any real institutional weight behind it, the order was reversed. The oral testimony came first. The old men's stories about a ship crushed in the ice near an island, a mast standing up out of shallow water, sailors seen walking south with sledges. These were no longer color, no longer folklore to be quoted in a footnote. They were the map. You can imagine what it must have felt like if you had spent your whole working life doing what Kamukak did, to watch that shift happen at last, slowly, in meeting rooms you were not always invited into. The recognition did not arrive as an apology. It arrived as a phone call, a shared document, a seat at a planning table beside historians who had once filed his letters and moved on. He took it, by every account, without bitterness. That was simply how he was. The ships that went north beginning in the late 2000s were not built like Franklin's. There is no ice this fleet feared getting stuck in, no 3 winters they expected to lose. Parks Canada worked with the Canadian Coast Guard, with the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, with Inuit organizations from the communities nearest the search grounds, and later with private partners who brought their own vessels and their own money. Picture a research ship the size of a large trawler, painted white and orange, moving at a walking pace across water that 6 months of the year is solid enough to drive a truck across. Below her, towed on a cable, a torpedo-shaped sonar unit sweeps the seabed side to side in long, overlapping lines, the way you might mow a lawn you cannot see. Nobody expects a fast answer. Everybody involved has read enough history to know that. If you were standing on the deck of one of those search vessels in the short Arctic summer, the work would look almost nothing like drama. You would feel the cold coming up through your boots long before you felt it in the air, and you would hear the low, steady hum of the sonar winch somewhere behind you, patient as a heartbeat. Days pass with the screen showing nothing but seabed, ridges, boulders, the pale scatter of old ice scour, and the operators watch it anyway, hour after hour, because the one day it shows something different will look, at first glance, almost exactly the same as all the days it did not. There is nothing you need to hold on to in that image except the patience of it, the sense of people willing to look at empty water for years on the strength of a story an old hunter had told them was true. But what does it actually take to search a seabed the size of a small country, one line at a time, with nothing but sonar and a story to guide you? It takes first a narrowing of where to look, and this is where the oral testimony did its quiet work. Search planners sat with elders and hunters from communities around King William Island and had them walk through, sometimes literally on a map spread across a table, the places where the old accounts placed the ships. Some of these accounts had been collected by Charles Francis Hall in the 1860s. Some gathered more recently by researchers working alongside Kamukak, and some carried simply as family memory, passed down without ever having been written anywhere at all. What emerged was not one single point on the water, but a set of overlapping possibilities, clustered mostly around the western side of the island and the strait south of it. Inuit testimony had, for generations, spoken of one ship going down in deep water off the coast, and another, smaller and closer to shore, in a bay to the south where it could be reached and, eventually, stripped for its wood and iron. You would not have known, standing on that search vessel, which cluster held the answer. Nobody did. The sonar lines were laid out to cover as much of the most likely ground as the short season allowed, a few weeks each year before the ice closed the water again and sent the ships home to wait. Some years produced nothing. Some years produced weather that ended the search before it had properly begun. A storm that kept the vessels in harbour. An ice pack that shifted in from the north and closed a channel that had been open a week before. If you have ever waited on something that depends entirely on weather you cannot control, you will recognize the particular flavor of that patience, the way each cancelled day gets absorbed quietly into the larger wait rather than treated as a defeat. And then, on a clear day in September of 2014, the pattern on the sonar screen stopped looking like seabed. It is worth pausing on how ordinary that moment must have felt before anyone understood what it was. A shape on a screen, longer and straighter than the rock around it, sitting upright on the bottom in water shallow enough that later dives could be done without the heaviest equipment. The searchers had learned by then not to celebrate too early. False alarms had come and gone for years, rock formations that briefly held everyone's breath before resolving into nothing. But this shape held. Divers went down and what they found, resting largely intact on a seabed lit by whatever grey light makes it that far down, was a wooden warship of exactly the right age, exactly the right build, sitting in almost precisely the water where Inuit testimony had been placing a wrecked ship for 150 years. It was Erebus. You do not have to remember the details of how they confirmed it. The bell recovered and its markings read. The hull dimensions matched against the Admiralty's own drafts. Only that the confirmation came, and that when it did, it came to rest on ground the old stories had already described. The search team that surfaced with that news was not, by most accounts, given to loud celebration, but something in the reporting afterward carried an unmistakable note of vindication. And it was not really a vindication for the sonar operators or the Coast Guard captains, careful and skilled as they had been. It was a vindication for Charles Francis Hall's long-dead informants, for Inuk Puji Juk and the others whose names barely survived the transcription, for every hunter who had told a British or American searcher exactly where to look and been thanked and then ignored. And it was a vindication, quiet and unspoken as it seems to have been for Louis Kamukak, who by then was still very much alive to hear it, and who had spent decades insisting that the stories were not myths at all, only directions nobody in power had been ready to follow. If you were listening to this from far away, from a warm room instead of a cold deck, that discovery would have felt like the end of the story. 160-odd years of searching, and here at last was one of the two ships, found more or less exactly where the people who actually lived on that coastline had said she would be the whole time. It would be easy, hearing it that way, to let your eyes close on that note and imagine the rest resolved itself neatly afterward. But it did not. Quite. And this is where the story sharpens rather than settles. Erebus was Franklin's own ship, the one he sailed in, the one his name is most tightly bound to. But she was not the last ship still moving under Crozier's command after Franklin died. And she was not the one the later Inuit accounts described as sinking on her own, mast still standing far from where Erebus had been crushed. Terror was still out there somewhere, and finding one ship exactly where the testimony had placed her only made the absence of the other feel sharper, not smaller. If the old stories had been right once, precisely and completely right, in water everyone had assumed too vast to search, then somewhere in that same body of testimony, unheard or half-heard, was very likely the answer to where terror lay as well. The question was no longer whether to trust the accounts. That question had been answered on the seabed near King William Island. The question now was which part of the story the searchers had not yet listened to closely enough. The search for terror had never really stopped, but for a long while it had drifted along under the wider search for Franklin's men and their whole doomed passage, one strand among many easy to lose in a rope of other questions. Now it pulled tight and separate. Now it was the thing itself. Every ship, every season, every dollar of a modest budget bent toward one hull, somewhere underwater that had already swallowed one secret and might be persuaded, if the searchers were patient enough, to give up a second. You can picture the work if you try, though it would not have looked like much from outside. It would have looked like people in a cramped cabin bent over screens and paper, the kind of work that never makes for a dramatic photograph. Archival researchers going back through logs and letters 170 years old, hunting for a phrase, a bearing, a half-remembered detail from a search party that had passed through in 1859 and written it down carelessly, never dreaming anyone would still be reading it this closely so long after. Cartographers laying transparent sheets of old coastline over new satellite imagery, watching how badly the shapes disagreed, and wondering each time whether the disagreement was the map's fault or the ice's. And underneath all of it, patient as tide, the layer that had been quietly proving itself for years now. The testimony gathered from Inuit families, passed down mouth to mouth, generation to generation, about ships seen where no European chart had ever placed one. By this point in the search, nobody serious was treating that testimony as folklore anymore. Erebus had settled the matter. She'd been found within a few miles of where the old accounts said a ship had gone down, in water so precisely described across a run of separate testimonies gathered decades apart from people who had never met each other. That coincidence stopped being a reasonable explanation. If you had stood in that cabin and watched the searchers work, you would have noticed how differently they handled the oral record now compared to how their predecessors had handled it a century and a half earlier. Before, it had been something to note in the margins, interesting but unreliable. Now it was the primary evidence. The search had learned the hard way and the slow way to listen properly. And it was Louis Kamukak's decades of listening, more than anyone else's, that gave the search its shape at this stage. He had spent the better part of his life doing exactly the kind of unglamorous work that never gets its due until long after it is finished, sitting with elders in Goa Haven and Taloyoke, recording stories that had been told and retold since before his own grandparents were born, cross-referencing one family's account against another's, noting where they agreed and where the disagreements might simply be two people describing the same place from two different seasons. He had never needed a ship or a research grant to do most of it. He had needed patience and time and the trust of people who had watched enough outsiders come looking for Franklin with enough certainty and enough disrespect that trust was not automatically given. Kamukak had earned his slowly, the way you earn most things worth having. His notebooks, by now, held years of this, names of bays, descriptions of wreckage, accounts of encampments where survivors had supposedly been seen. Sorting it for terror specifically meant going back through material that had originally been gathered with Erebus in mind, or with no particular ship in mind at all, just the general terrible fact of the expedition's loss, and asking a narrower question of it. Which of these stories, if any, pointed toward a second vessel rather than the one already found? It was slow work, the kind that asks you to sit with pages long after anyone else has gone to bed, turning the same handful of sentences over and over until they either give up something new or confirm that they have already told you everything they are going to tell. But even the richest archive of second-hand testimony has its limits, and what the search needed now, more than another layer of inherited story, was somebody who had seen something with his own eyes. Which is where a hunter named Sami Kogvik enters this part of the story, and where the search takes the turn that will matter most. Cogvic was from Joa Haven, a hunter and a ranger who knew the land and the ice around King William Island the way you know a room you have walked through in the dark 1,000 times without needing to look. Years before any of this search work reached him, he had been out on a hunting trip with a companion, traveling by snowmobile across the frozen coastline near a place called Terror Bay, when something had caught his eye jutting up out of the ice. A pole, dark and out of place against the white, standing where nothing should have been standing. He had gone to look. What he described, afterward, was something that looked very much like a mast, a long timber rising at an angle from the frozen surface, alone, with no ship visible around it, no obvious explanation for what it was doing there. He had taken a photograph, or believed he had, though the details of exactly what became of that image would later grow uncertain in the retelling, the way small facts do over years. What stayed clear in his memory, the part he kept coming back to, was the shape of the thing and the strange, private awe of finding it. For a long time, that memory simply lived where memories like it usually live in a small northern community, told to family, told to friends, filed away as one more curious thing seen out on the land, not urgent, not connected to anything in particular. Cogvic did not spend those years thinking of himself as a witness to anything historic. He was a hunter who had seen something odd once, the way hunters sometimes do, and moved on with his life. It was only later, once the search for Franklin's ships had become a subject people in Joa Haven were talking about again, that the memory found its way to the people who needed it, carried, as so much in this story has been carried, through relationships rather than institutions, one person mentioning it to another until it reached researchers with the Arctic Research Foundation and the ears to understand what they were hearing. If you were sitting in that room when the account was first laid out properly, you would have felt the particular quiet that settles over people who suspect they have just been handed something important and are trying not to get ahead of themselves. A pole in the ice, seen years before, near a bay that already carried weight in the older testimony Kamukak had spent decades assembling. Two separate threads of evidence, gathered through completely different means, by completely different people, at completely different times. One an oral archive built patiently over a lifetime, the other a single hunter's private memory of a strange afternoon on the ice, arriving independently at the same stretch of water. There is nothing you need to hold on to here beyond that feeling, the quiet click of two things fitting together that were never meant to be compared. Let the rest settle around it as we go. Because that is what narrowed the search in the end, not a single dramatic clue, but the slow overlap of two kinds of memory, the collective and the personal, both pointing toward the same modest curve of coastline. Terror Bay. A name that had likely meant nothing in particular to most people outside the region, and everything to the people who had lived along it and passed its stories down. Kamukak's material had already flagged the general area as significant, drawn from testimony about wreckage and encampments gathered over years from elders who themselves had heard it from elders before them. Cogvic's account gave it something sharper, a specific memory, tied to a specific season of an object that behaved exactly like a mast breaking the ice where a mast had no earthly business being. You would not have felt urgency in that room if you had been there, not the kind that makes people raise their voices or reach for a phone. The mood was calmer than that, and stranger, the particular quiet of people who have learned the hard way, not to celebrate before the water gives up its answer. Everyone in that search had watched hope curdle before. They had watched confident theories dissolve against blank sonar returns, watched seasons close with nothing but fuel spent and patience thinned. So the narrowing of the search area toward Terror Bay was treated the way careful people treat good news in a place that has disappointed them before, gratefully and with both hands still ready to let it go. Still, a shape was forming that had not existed a season earlier. The search area, which had once meant hundreds of square miles of largely unexamined water, contracted toward a single bay small enough to be covered properly, methodically, without the desperate breadth of earlier years. Kamukak's decades of listening had built the frame. Kogvik's memory of a mast in the ice had placed the picture inside it. And somewhere in the calculations that followed, the weather windows, the fuel, the narrow stretch of open water season the Arctic allows before the ice closes its hand again, a decision was made to take the ship there and see. The vessel moved into position the way these things always did in this story, without ceremony, without anyone on board, especially expecting the moment to matter as much as it would. The engines dropped to a hush as she came into the bay, the water beneath her darker and stiller than the open channel behind, the kind of stillness that swallows sound rather than carrying it. Sonar equipment was checked, lowered, checked again. If you had been standing at the rail as it went down into the cold, you would have felt how ordinary it looked and how little that ordinariness matched what everyone on board was quietly hoping for, the screen below decks about to fill, in whatever direction the water chose to answer, with a shape that either was or was not a ship. The screen below decks did not fill all at once. It came the way most important things come at sea, in pieces, in passes, the sonar sweeping back and forth across the bay floor, while the numbers along the edge of the display ticked through depth that meant nothing to you unless you had spent your life reading them. And then, on one pass, and not the one before it, a shape began to hold its edges. Not a smear, not the soft grey nothing of silt and rock. A line straight where nothing in nature is straight, running the length of the screen and holding its shape as the ship above it moved on and the sonar kept looking. If you had been standing in that low room, lit by the cold light of the display and by nothing else, you would have felt the whole space go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with anyone asking for silence. It is the particular quiet of people who are afraid that speaking will break whatever it is they are looking at. The shape resolved slowly into something no one in that room needed a chart to recognize. A hull, upright, sitting on the bottom the way a hull sits when it has settled rather than broken. A line of deck running its length. The stub shapes of masts still rising from it, not flat and scattered as wreckage usually lies, but standing, or close enough to standing, that the first response from the people watching was not triumph, but disbelief. The specific disbelief of seeing something survive that had no business surviving. Hatches. The dark rectangle of an open hold. A shape near the stern that would later be called out, carefully, as a davit, still roughly where a davit belongs. You do not need to know what a davit is to feel what it means that one was still there, still attached, still doing on the seabed something like the job it was built to do above it. There is nothing you need to hold on to here except the shape of it, resting, patient, waiting in water that had kept its secret for the better part of 2 centuries. Confirmation did not come as a shout. It came the way confirmation comes to careful people, in measurements taken and taken again, in comparisons run against old drawings and old tonnage figures, in the slow elimination of any other explanation for a hull of that length lying in that bay. But the bay itself was doing most of the confirming before anyone opened a single drawing. This was not open water. This was not a stretch of coastline picked at random from a chart and searched because no one had a better idea. This was the bay that had carried a name in Inuit testimony for longer than anyone searching it had been alive, passed from person to person, hunting story to hunting story, long before any ship with sonar had come north to listen. The wreck had not been found in spite of where the stories placed it. It had been found inside the very water the stories had been pointing to all along, sitting exactly where generations of testimony said something large and foreign had gone down. Word of it moved differently than word usually moves. There was no crowd on a dock, no crush of reporters at a gangway, because the confirmation happened at sea, in a small vessel among a small number of people who had spent years being told that what they were looking for likely was not there to be found, or was there in a place no one could agree on. What passed between them in that room was quieter than celebration. It was closer to relief, the particular relief of people who have been patient for a very long time and are only now allowed to stop bracing for disappointment. You would have felt it too, standing there, not the urge to cheer, but the urge to sit down. What the search had found, resting upright in that bay, was terror. The finding of one ship in that search, arguably, would have been remarkable on its own. What made this moment different from the earlier one, from the discovery that had come before it further south, was the water it was found in. That earlier ship had been located roughly where searchers had expected a ship to end up, given the currents and the drift and the long guesswork of ice science. This one was not where the ice alone would have carried it. This one was where people had said it would be. Not officials, not naval records, not the expedition's own last written orders. The search itself had, in the end, gone back to the same body of testimony it had spent the better part of a century and a half treating as folklore, and had found waiting in the cold water of that testimony's own bay exactly what it had been told to expect. But what does it actually mean for a wreck like this to be found, not glimpsed on a screen for a few passes of a sonar, but properly found, entered, understood? That is a slower story, and a stranger one, because what waited under that hull was not a scattered ruin. It was something closer to a ship still holding its own shape, and there is a particular kind of quiet that settles over people who go looking for wreckage and find instead something that still looks like it remembers being a ship. The masts were the first thing that unsettled the divers, who eventually went down to see her properly, because masts are not supposed to still be there. Wrecks lose their masts early, usually in the sinking itself or in the long decades of storms that follow it, snapped off and scattered, buried separately from the hull that once carried them. Terrors had not gone that way. Rising from her decks, softened by more than a century of cold water but recognizably upright, they gave the wreck a silhouette that read, on the sonar and later on camera, less like debris and more like a ship simply anchored somewhere it should not have been able to reach, waiting for a crew that had never come back to raise sail. If you had been the one lowering a camera down that first time, you would have understood, in the moment the light caught those shapes, why no one in that boat said very much for a while. Below the masts, the hatches told their own quiet story. Several were found closed, sealed the way a crew seals a ship they mean to return to, not the way wreckage lies when it has been torn open by collision or scattered by a slow structural collapse. One was found open, and through it, the divers' lights picked out something that made the whole wreck feel less like an artifact and more like a room someone had only just left. Shelving still upright, glass still in at least one window, the ordered shapes of what looked like plates and bottles resting where gravity and time had left them rather than where violence had thrown them. The cold of that water, the same cold that had made the search take so many decades, had also been quietly preserving what it swallowed, holding the ship's interior in something close to the condition it had been in on the last ordinary day. Anyone aboard it woke up expecting another ordinary day to follow. It would be easy, telling it this way, to let the moment swell into triumph, and that is exactly the shape the story refuses to take. The people in that boat, and the people who watched the footage afterward on land, did not treat what they were looking at as a trophy. They treated it, by every account that survives of that day, the way you treat a grave you have finally been allowed to visit. With the lights kept low, the movements careful, the talk kept to what needed saying and no more. 2 ships, 2 crews, more than 100 men, had gone into that ice fully expecting to sail through to the other side of a continent, and what the search had finally located was not proof of a triumph, but proof of an ending, sitting quiet and intact on a cold floor a very long way from open water. And somewhere in the quiet correspondence that followed, in the calls and letters between the searchers and the small northern community that had spent so many years pointing them toward that bay, one name kept surfacing, the way it always did. Louis Kamukak did not live to see divers' lights moving through those preserved hatches. He had spent his last years gathering testimony that the search would later prove correct, almost to the point of exactness, sitting with elders, matching old stories to old maps, insisting patiently that the water already held its own answer if anyone would only take the trouble to listen properly. He was not on that boat, but the bay the sonar had swept, the bay whose name had been carried down through generations of hunting stories long before it carried a naval one, was the bay his work, and the work of those before him had pointed toward for years. The confirmation that came through that screen below decks was, in its quiet way, a confirmation of him too, and of every witness before him whose account had been filed away decades earlier as something interesting but unreliable. There is no dramatic way to close a story like this one, and it would be wrong to try to make one. The ship sits where it sits, upright, its masts still reaching a little way up into water that never gets truly light. Its hatches remain closed over rooms that no one will ever hurry through. The people who found it went home quietly, the way people go home after visiting a grave rather than after winning something. And the story that had traveled from mouth to mouth in the north for longer than anyone could properly measure had, in the end, simply been true all along, waiting patiently in the cold for the rest of the world to catch up to it. If you have made it this far with your eyes already closed, that is exactly where you are meant to be. I hope the ship found its rest in that quiet water, and I hope you find yours just as easily tonight. Thank you for spending these hours with me, wherever in the story you drifted off. The rest of it will still be here whenever you want to come back and hear the parts you missed. If you'd like, there are more of these old ships waiting quietly on this channel, whenever you need somewhere calm to fall asleep again. For now, though, there is nothing more to hold on to. Let it go and sleep well.